Well, everyone in this story sounds like they are hearing from God. Only one of them actually is. And for most of the Bible, telling the two apart was not obvious. It was not obvious to kings. It was not obvious to crowds standing in the street. Sometimes it was not even obvious to the prophets themselves. Picture a hillside above a Moabite camp. A hired seer stands on the ridge, arms raised, altar smoking behind him, a king waiting on his word. His name is Balaam, and he has a reputation. When Balaam blesses a people, they win. When he curses a people, they lose. A king named Balak has paid him well to curse Israel. Camped in the valley below like a storm cloud, Balaam opens his mouth, and instead of a curse, a blessing comes out. 3 times. Balak is furious. Balaam shrugs, almost bored, and says something close to this. I can only speak what God puts in my mouth. It sounds like faithfulness. It sounds like a man who cannot be bought. Remember that feeling, because it will not last. This is the story of false prophets in the Bible. Not villains in black robes hissing lies. Real people, gifted people, some of them right most of the time, who ended up leading nations toward disaster while sounding completely sure of themselves. And by the end of this video, you are going to have a test. A real one. 3 questions the Bible itself gives you to run any voice through a preacher, a pastor, an influencer with a verse in their bio. Even the voice in your own head that says God told me to do this. But first, you need to see how far this goes. Because later, in the final years before Jerusalem burned to the ground, in the year 70, a man will stand near the temple gates and tell 50,000 terrified people that deliverance is coming any minute now. Stay where you are. Wait for the sign. We will get to what happened to them. But not yet. Back to Balaam. Here is the detail almost nobody remembers about him. The detail that changes everything. He blessed Israel 3 times, word perfect, undeniably from God. And then, when the blessing did not work and the money was on the table, he found another way in. Numbers chapter 31 tells you plainly, it was Balaam's advice that got Israelite men sleeping with Moabite women at Baal-peor. A plague that killed 24,000 people. He could not curse them from outside. So he showed them how to curse themselves from inside. A man can prophesy the truth on Monday and sell you a lie on Tuesday. That is the first thing you need to understand about this whole subject. And it is the thing that makes it dangerous. False prophecy is not always a false voice. Sometimes it is a true voice, rented out. The Hebrew for what Balaam eventually became is Nabi Sheker, a prophet of the lie. Not a liar who happens to prophesy, a prophet whose prophecy has gone rotten. The word Nabi just means one who is called. Sheker means falsehood, emptiness, a promise with nothing behind it. Put them together and you get the most dangerous combination in the Bible. Real access to something spiritual, aimed at the wrong outcome. Now, fast forward a few hundred years, to a room with 400 prophets in it. King Ahab of Israel wants to go to war and take back a city called Ramoth-Gilead. He invites the king of Judah to join him. And the king of Judah, a cautious man named Jehoshaphat, asks a simple question first. Ask the Lord about it. So Ahab calls in his prophets. 400 of them. 400 men, robed, trained, official, standing in front of 2 kings on a threshing floor at the city gate. And every single one of them says the same thing. Go up. You will win. The Lord will give it into your hand. One of them, a man named Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, is so confident he makes iron horns with his hands and acts it out. With these you will gore the Syrians until they are finished. 400 voices. One message. Total agreement. Here is what you need to notice. Total agreement is not evidence of truth. It is one of the oldest tricks in the room. When everyone around a king says exactly what the king wants to hear, using the language of God to say it, that is not consensus. That is a chorus built to drown something out. And Jehoshaphat, to his credit, is not satisfied. Is there not one more prophet of the Lord we can ask? Ahab's answer is almost funny, if it were not so honest. There is one more. Micaiah, son of Imlah. But I hate him, because he never prophesies anything good about me, only bad. Sit with that sentence for a second. The king already knows which voice tells the truth. He just does not want to hear it. That, more than any theology textbook, is the real definition of a false prophet's appeal. It is not that people cannot tell the difference. It is that the true voice is inconvenient and the false voice is comfortable. Micaiah is brought in anyway, in chains, practically dragged. The messenger tells him on the way everyone else said yes. You should probably say yes too, just to keep the peace. And Micaiah's answer becomes one of the most quietly devastating lines in the Old Testament. As the Lord lives, well, whatever the Lord says to me, that I will speak. Then he tells Ahab the truth. You will die in this battle. Israel will scatter like sheep, without a shepherd. Zedekiah walks over and slaps him across the face. If 400 men agree and one man disagrees, guess who gets punished for being right? Ahab goes to war anyway. He disguises himself. So no one will target the king. An enemy soldier draws his bow at random, not aiming at anyone in particular, and the arrow finds the one gap in Ahab's armor. He bleeds out in his chariot by evening. 400 confident voices. One quiet, hated, accurate one. Here is your second thing to notice, and it is the question you should be asking right now. How do you actually tell them apart in the moment? Because in this story, and in almost every story like it in the Bible, the false prophets did not sound less spiritual than the true one. They sounded more certain, more aggressive, more willing to perform. Zedekiah made props. He put on a show. Micaiah just told the truth in a flat, tired voice and got hit in the face for it. If your only test for a prophetic voice is confidence, volume, or how good the performance is, you will fail this test every single time. We are going to come back to what the real test is. But not yet. There is one more figure from this same era worth naming because she shows the other face of false prophecy, not a battlefield cheerleader, but a queen who imported an entire religious system and staffed it with paid voices. Jezebel, wife of Ahab, kept 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah on her own payroll, eating at her table. Centuries later, in the last book of the Bible, John, writing to a church in a city called Thyatira, uses her name again as a kind of code word for a self-proclaimed prophetess inside their own congregation who was teaching people to compromise. The name becomes a category. A false prophet is not always someone outside the walls. Sometimes they are already inside, already trusted, already at the table. If this is landing for you, stay with me, because what I am about to show you next is the part most people never reach the moment. A false prophet stood face to face with a true one in public and told him directly he was wrong. And the part after that, where we go back to that crowd in Jerusalem in the year 70, is the reason I made this video. Jump forward again to Jerusalem, roughly 600 years before the crowd at the temple gates, in the days before the city's first destruction by Babylon. A prophet named Jeremiah has been telling everyone the same hard message for years. Submit to Babylon, do not resist. This judgment is coming and fighting it will only make it worse. It is not a popular message. It has never once been a popular message. Then a man named Hananiah, son of Azur, stands up in the temple, in front of priests and people, and contradicts him publicly. Within 2 years, Hananiah says, God will break the yoke of Babylon. All the exiles will come home. Everything will go back to normal. And here is what should stop you: cold. Jeremiah's first reaction is not anger. It is longing. He says, Amen. May the Lord do so. I wish you were right. That is worth sitting with. A true prophet does not want judgment to be true. He is not hoping for disaster to prove himself correct. He would rather be wrong and see his people spared than right and see them suffer. But wishing does not make it true. Jeremiah tells Hananiah plainly that prophets before both of them have always had to prove their words against time, and that a prophet who promises peace only earns credit when peace actually shows up. Hananiah does not back down. He grabs the wooden yoke off Jeremiah's neck, a prop Jeremiah had been wearing as a visual sermon, and breaks it in front of the crowd. It is theater. It is confident, physical, crowd-pleasing theater, and it is completely wrong. Jeremiah goes away and comes back with a harder word. You have broken a wooden yoke. An iron one is coming instead. And then the line that ends it. Hananiah, you have made this people trust in a lie. Within 2 months, Hananiah is dead, not executed, not punished by a mob. He simply dies, exactly on the timeline Jeremiah gave him. The test built into the law of Moses was always this practical, this measurable. If what a prophet says does not come true, that prophet was never speaking for God at all, and you do not have to be afraid of him. That is one test, does it come true? But the Bible gives you at least 2 more. And you need both, because truth alone is not enough. Deuteronomy chapter 13 adds a second layer that should make you uncomfortable. Even if a prophet's sign comes true, if that prophet is pointing you away from God and towards something else, you still do not follow him. Accuracy is not the whole test. Direction matters as much as accuracy. A false prophet can be right about the weather and wrong about everything that matters. Move forward again, past the exile, past the return, into the earliest years of the church, and the pattern has not changed at all, it has just changed its costume. In the city of Samaria, a man named Simon has spent years amazing crowds with magic, so good at it that people call him the power of God. When the apostles arrive, and people start receiving something real, not a trick, not a performance, Simon watches. Peter and John lay hands on believers and sees actual power move. And his instinct, the very first thing he reaches for, is his wallet. "Give me this power too," he says to Peter, "so that anyone I lay hands on will receive it," and he offers money for it. Peter's response is not gentle. "Your silver perish with you, because you thought the gift of God could be bought with money. Your heart is not right before God." Notice what exposed Simon. It was not a wrong prediction. It was what he wanted power for. He did not want to serve God. He wanted God's power to serve him, to build his own name back up, the name he had already built on being amazing. One more, and then we move to the part that changes how you see all of this. On the island of Cyprus, the Apostle Paul and his companion Barnabas are brought before a Roman official who wants to hear about God. Standing beside that official is a Jewish sorcerer, a self-described prophet named Bar-Jesus, also called Elymas. And the moment Paul starts speaking the truth, Elymas moves to block it, trying to turn the official away from the faith. Paul does not argue theology with him. He looks straight at him and says it plainly. "You son of the devil, you enemy of all righteousness, full of deceit and trickery, will you never stop twisting the straight paths of the Lord?" Elymas goes blind on the spot, groping for someone to lead him by the hand. The Greek word the New Testament uses, for men like this, over and over, is pseudoprophets, false prophet, literally a counterfeit. Not a prophet. Who made one mistake, a category, a recurring role that keeps showing up in every generation, wearing a slightly different face. Balaam's face, Zedekiah's face, Hananiah's face, Simon's face, Elymas's face, always sounding like the real thing, always aimed at something other than the truth. If this is landing for you, stay with me, because what comes next is the reason I made this video in the first place, and it is the part I promised you at the beginning. Now back to that crowd, at the temple, in the year 70, in the last desperate weeks before Jerusalem fell to Rome. The historian Josephus was there, or close enough to it, writing it down while the ash was still falling. He describes a self-proclaimed prophet who stood in the city and told the people that God had commanded them to go up to the temple courts, that there they would receive miraculous signs of their deliverance, and people believed him. 6,000 of them, men, women, and children, crowded onto the porticos of the temple, waiting for rescue that had been promised in God's own name. Roman soldiers set the structure on fire. Every one of them died in the flames, or jumping from the height to escape it. One voice, one promise, 6,000 people who trusted it completely. This is loop 1, the detail we planted at the very start of this video. Now you know what it cost. Here is the question underneath everything you have watched tonight. How does anyone survive a moment like that? surrounded by confident voices, all speaking in God's name, all pointing in different directions. The Bible's answer is not a feeling. It is not, "I just knew in my spirit." It is 3 concrete, repeatable tests, and you can run every voice in your life through all 3. First, does it come true? Not eventually. Well, not someday. Not in God's timing forever deferred. Jeremiah's test. If someone keeps making specific claims that keep quietly failing, and keeps moving the goalposts instead of admitting it, that is data. Use it. Second, where does it point? Deuteronomy's harder test. Even a prophet who gets things right can still be leading you away from what is actually true and good. Ask what a message is actually building in you. Dependence on the messenger, fear, control, isolation from people who love you. Or is it building character that would stand up even if the messenger disappeared tomorrow? Third, what is the fruit? Jesus puts this most plainly of all, warning his own followers centuries after Balaam and Hananiah and Elamas. Watch out for false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but underneath are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruit, not by their confidence, not by how good the performance is, not by how many people are standing behind them nodding, by what actually grows out of their lives and out of the lives of the people who follow them over time. In the open, this is not just an ancient problem. In 1933, a movement inside the German church calling itself the German Christians stood in pulpits across the country and blessed the rise of a new regime as the hand of God moving in history, purging the church of anything that did not fit the new order. Confident, popular official, and a young pastor named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, watching this happen, refused to go along with it, insisting that the church's only true head could not be replaced by a state, no matter how much religious language surrounded it. He would spend the rest of the decade increasingly isolated for that position, and eventually give his life for it. The chorus was loud. Bonhoeffer was quiet, inconvenient, and right the same shape as Micaiah, standing alone in front of 400 voices. The same shape it always takes. That is loop 2, resolved. It was never about volume. It was never about certainty. It has always been about truth, direction, and fruit visible over time to anyone willing to actually look. And that is loop 3 as well, the thing this whole video has been building toward. Jeremiah stood alone in that temple courtyard, hated by the very people he was trying to save, wearing a broken wooden yoke, watching a more confident man tear his warning apart in front of a cheering crowd. He was not vindicated in that room. He was mocked in that room. He was vindicated years later when Babylon's armies came exactly as he said they would. And by then, it was too late for anyone to thank him. That is the cost of being the true voice in a room full of false ones. It rarely feels like winning while it is happening. So here is what to carry with you out of this video. 3 things, and they are not complicated. 1. A false prophet is rarely a stranger with a warning sign on their chest. Balaam blessed Israel 3 times before he sold them out. Simon Magus had already amazed a whole city before money exposed his heart. The most dangerous voices are the ones with a real track record, because that track record is exactly what makes you stop checking. 2. This is not just a story about kings and prophets. It is about every voice you let speak into your life right now. The preacher, the online teacher, the confident friend, who always seems to know exactly what God is saying, even the version of yourself that talks yourself into things and calls it faith. Run it through the test. Does it come true? Where does it point? What is the actual fruit over time, in the open? 3. And this is the one that should sit with you tonight. Truth is almost never the loudest voice in the room. It was one hated man against 400 confident ones. It was a broken yoke against a whole crowd cheering for the man who snapped it. It was 6,000 people who followed a promise straight into a fire. And it was one historian writing it down afterward so that you would know. Being right does not usually feel like winning while you are the one saying it. That is not a reason to doubt the truth. That is exactly what it has always looked like to hold it. Which one of these false prophets surprised you the most tonight? Balaam, the 400, Hananiah, or the man at the temple in the year 70? Tell me below, and tell me which test you are going to start using this week.